you for coming out for this evening's University of St. Francis lecture series here at the Allen County Public Library. Tonight we are welcoming Dr. Kuebler Wolf, who is an associate professor of art history at the University of St. Francis. So thank you for coming out tonight.
Hi, everyone, and good evening. Thank you for being here. Before I start this talk, I wanted to give you a little background, which is in the 1990s, when I was in graduate school, I approached my dissertation advisor and said, I have two ideas for a dissertation topic. And one of them is the history of images of slavery in the antebellum South. And the other one is the history of paint-by-number painting. And she looked at me, she thought for a second, and she said, do the serious one so you can get a job. And then later you can write a book about that. So that is what I did. So this is fun for me tonight because it's the first time I've really been able to present work that I've been thinking about off and on for a couple of decades. So I just wanted to preface that because I think it's really interesting that her first reaction was paint by numbers is not serious. And really what's kind of behind this research is that paint by numbers actually is serious. There's some serious things for us to think about and learn from them. So with that, I'm going to present you Every Man a Rembrandt, the meaning of paint by numbers in post-war American culture.
Picture of a boy with a picture on his mind, a picture he's going to paint himself. The young man isn't just daydreaming, he will turn out a painting, and in oils at that.
Every Man a Rembrandt was the slogan of the most popular maker of paint-by-number kits in the 1950s and 60s. This was a company called Palmer Paint that was located in Detroit, Michigan, and the series that they created of paint-by-numbers paintings was called the Craftmaster series. We have become accustomed to thinking of paint by numbers as a pejorative way to describe something that requires little to no thinking, has no originality, or is simply formulaic. In fact, one 1950s critic of paint by numbers complained that the kits were only enjoyed by, and I'm quoting him from Art in America, morons who were willing to be regimented into brushing paint on a jigsaw miscellany of dictated shapes, and all by rote. In other words, sheep. Uneducated, unoriginal sheep. And I think while it's common for people to talk about paint by numbers either as a funny example of conformity in the 1950s or as bad art, or even to celebrate the lowbrow and kitschy nature of paint by numbers productions, the history of paint by number kits in America is more complex and layered than we might assume because of those assumptions about the term. So tonight we're going to investigate the culture of the 50s and investigate some of the reasons why paint by number became so popular after World War II. In particular, we'll think about the phrase, every man a Rembrandt, what that meant given the obvious differences between a typical Rembrandt painting and a typical paint by numbers kit production. So let's take a look at the disparity here between a Rembrandt painting and a portrait done by paint by numbers. Paint by numbers images are characterized by really clearly delineated areas of color and design, right? Whereas Rembrandt was really the master of the highlight and the inky shadow. His paints were always very blended, right? They were always very, there's a kind of glow that comes out of a Rembrandt painting and a sense of light that you do not get in a paint by numbers kit. You also have dramatic, a limited number of tones, but then this very dramatic contrast between deep inky shadows and diffuse golden highlights. In the middle of the 20th century, Rembrandt's name might have evoked notions of the individual genius artist, but his style and that of a paint by numbers canvas are really different. And I think the ease with which this slogan was adopted, nevertheless, for use with paint by numbers marketing has something to tell us about why paint by numbers became so popular after World War II. So these kits exploded into popularity in a culture in which there were already firmly established ideas about who artists were and what they meant in American society and European society too. This starts in the 19th century, for example, with a very popular mid-century Parisian novel called La Vie Bohème, which was the story of tragic starving artists in a garret, one of whom dies of tuberculosis very tragically. This becomes a very popular opera by Puccini called La Bohème. In the 20th century, we're familiar with this revival in the Broadway musical Rent, which is based on La Bohème. It's the same story. And the criteria I have here on the slide, I think, are worth noting. The lone genius, who is the artist, does it alone. You need to be psychologically tormented in some way to create great art. You also must be poor or misunderstood in order to make great art in your own lifetime. People can't appreciate you. And ideally, you also die an early death from tragic complications of any combination of the factors above. Okay? So that's well established by the 20th century. And then you have the popular culture of the 1950s and 60s really reiterating that with some of the major blockbusters and Academy Award-winning pictures of the 1950s. So I've got them in order here. So some of you may have seen these, I hope. Moulin Rouge, the original, not the Ewan McGregor version. Moulin Rouge, which won Jose Ferrer the Oscar for Best Actor in a Motion Picture for portraying Toulouse-Lautrec. Lust for Life, which won for art direction, and that was Kirk Douglas as Vincent van Gogh. And then 1965's Agony in the Ecstasy, which featured Charlton Heston as Michelangelo and Rex Harrison as Pope Julius. So just to give you an idea, right? I mean, and I think these posters are kind of fun to look at because you can see there's certain ideas about what an artist's life is like that are kind of embedded in these posters, right? The very sexy, glamorous world of the artist. The one for Van Gogh really cracks me up because he never really painted sexy nudes. Like, he painted a couple of really broken down poor women naked, but nothing like this. So it's an interesting thing. So part of when you say you're invoking a great artist in the 1950s, like a Rembrandt, is you're invoking some of these ideas about originality and genius and inimitability and suffering that don't seem to coincide with painting a paint-by-numbers picture in your living room. Before those post-war films, we had a Rembrandt version of this done by Alexander Korda, who is a British director. So Charles Laughton was one of the prime major international movie stars of this earlier part of the 20th century. And these are two posters advertising his turn as Rembrandt. This movie focuses on the period of Rembrandt's life when he was broke. He had gotten a woman pregnant out of wedlock, and it's sort of like wasn't able to sell work. Basically, scandal-ridden, sex scandal-ridden, poverty and despair, right? And so these are all kind of ideas that are behind when you invoke some of these great artist names. These are things that are culturally baggage that come as part of that. In this period of time, one of the most well-known of these collection of artists was Rembrandt. And here is one of the most well-known images from the early to middle, well, it's from the 1600s, but it was very well known in the 20th century and widely reproduced as one of Rembrandt's greatest paintings. That is The Man with the Golden Helmet there on the left. At the time, this was considered to be a portrait by the artist of his brother. It was a popular picture to represent in the so-called picture study movement. I'm showing you a page of the catalog for the picture study movement here. It's important to understand the picture study movement and Rembrandt. So I want to say Rembrandt van Rijn, who was a Dutch old master painter and printmaker who lived from 1606 to 1669, was the most widely collected Old Master in America between about 1880 and 1930. American millionaires aggressively collected Rembrandt, guided by an enterprising art dealer named Joseph Duveen. during the Gilded Age of American industrial expansion between the 1890s and the early 1900s. These millionaires, also known as robber barons, were also responsible for funding the first major museums in America and donating their personal collections to those major museums. At the same time, art was being integrated into public school curricula under the guidance of theorists like John Dewey. Those museums then became the source of educational materials about art. So American kids of the 20s and 30s, who would later be the GIs of World War II, would have learned about Rembrandt's greatest hits via the picture study movement, which is what I'm showing you here, Rembrandt and the picture study movement catalog. And this would be the method of art education. Picture study involved reproductions of famous works of art and a little catalog explanation of what was so important about that work. And then those cards could be circulated to the kids, and they would write essays about what they learned to understand the history of art. So they weren't making images based on these, they were just learning the art history. American expert collectors and dealers focused on Rembrandt pictures because he was believed to be more adept at psychological evaluation and the portrayal of the individual than any other of the old masters of his time. In fact, he was kind of thought of as the modern break with a more rigid and unimaginative past. He seemed to usher in an era of deeper insight into individuality. And for at least 2 generations, this particular picture was held up as the gold standard, no pun intended, of artistic accomplishment in that vein. In fact, people talked about, the deep psychology of the man in the golden helmet, who was thought to be Rembrandt's brother, and sort of, there's a lot of articles about what this painting means and what it reveals to us about feelings, okay? Later in the 1960s, it was actually determined that this was not painted by Rembrandt. It was probably painted by somebody in his circle, which is why I have it like circle there, possibly by one of his cousins whose last name was Van Plume, and he's got a plume in his helmet. So one scholar has said it's probably the signature of Van Plume is kind of included there. I don't think that makes it any less of an interesting painting, but in an art market where brand names are really important, he went from being, you have to see this picture in Berlin in all the guidebooks, to now it's not mentioned. It's a really interesting thing. So there's something about that idea of the original genius in the hand of the artist that also feeds into how we think about paint by numbers, okay, with work like this. So you can think of Rembrandt as shorthand for the great artist, right? So like you want to be a great artist, you want to be Rembrandt. You could in fact paint your own Rembrandts with at least 2 kits issued by paint-by-number companies in the 50s. Here I'm showing you Craftmaster's Man in Armor, designed by artist Adam Grant, and based on, as you can see, Rembrandt's Man in Armor. Craftmaster, the Palmer paint brand, one source estimates that between 1951 and 54, Palmer Paint had sold 12 million Craftmaster kits total, and we know that there were up to 35 other companies producing kits at the same time. I've been able to locate one other Rembrandt, Paint Your Own Rembrandt, which was by another company called Artcraft, and it's a portrait of Aristotle contemplating the bust of Homer. It's another famous, So I'm just going to stop and note that I think you can see there are certainly challenges to adopting this kind of style with these incredible highlights and lowlights, where there's a really, really careful blending and transition between areas of color and tone. It's just hard to reproduce that. You can see, right, there's a much more sense of like linear areas of color where the different contrasts are being slotted in. Now, that's not to say that the Adam Grant designed one is a bad painting. It's serving very different purposes. And I'll get on my soapbox for 1 second and say, as an art historian, I usually don't even ask whether paintings are bad or good, because I don't feel like it's a historically useful question. If there's 500 bad paintings and they're super popular, or what I would call bad paintings, I need to know why were they so popular, right? So I think it's important to note that paint by numbers exploded in popularity after the war, but it's not a new idea. Here in 1931, you can see a paint-by-numbers kit, although it wasn't branded paint-by-number, created by a toy manufacturing company in cooperation with Paramount Pictures. So this little kit from 31 was meant to be a kind of take-home merchandise, tie into the movie Tom Sawyer starring Jackie Coogan. And it is the same kind of setup that you see in later paint-by-numbers kits. Here on the cover, you have Tom painting his friend, Huckleberry Finn. I'm not aware that that's actually a story in the actual thing. I think they paint a fence, right? So it's kind of interesting to see here. But you can see it has the kind of components you would expect. It has the colors that you need and little guidebooks for how to use the colors. This is actually a company that was producing little artist kits, as they were called, in the 20s as well. So paint by numbers had been around, and it was usually marketed as a toy that was educational for children. None of them seem to have taken off the way that paint by numbers did after the war, though. And here's just a view of the inside where you can see it is really using the same idea, right? These linear outlines, and then the numbers in each section tell you which color to paint. So it's very much the same idea. But again, educational for children. There's one notable exception to this, however. Now, these painting kits patents go back to the 1920s for these. In 1946, we start to see a different market. The Alameda Naval Station out in California in 1946, immediately after the war, created an enormous, what they called, hobby shop. And they contracted with a manufacturing company from Decatur, Illinois, called Picturecraft. And Picturecraft did exactly what you see here. They created, now this is a slightly later kit from 1953, they would create a outlined image, numbered where you put your paint colors, right? Rolled it up in a tube and mailed it to you with a little set of paints. Starting in 1946, the military was buying a lot of these for the GIs that were still on active duty after the war. And as you can see, it has some features that Craftmaster will improve on. So, for example, you don't get a full-size color picture to guide you, so you don't know exactly what you're supposed to be painting. You just have to hope that you get it right when you're done. Yeah. So leisure at Alameda was serious business. The base commander, Charles Cox, had been in charge of vocational education in the Alameda school system before the war, had done some study of art education. Was responsible for the Navy constructing a 2-story building that could accommodate 500 people at a time and provided facilities for 31 DIY hobbies, among which were, I just want to give you a sense, because this is the DIY culture that's coming out of the war: pattern making, machine shop, woodwork, welding, foundry, forging, metal jewelry design, model engines, model trains, glass blowing, electroplating, weaving, printing, lapidary, pottery, leather tooling, photography, linoleum working, silk screening, wood carving, photo engraving, archery, radio and amplifiers, model planes, alabaster, art, oils and watercolor, as well as drawing, fly tying, plastics, model art, auto racers, bookbinding, and tailoring. Impressive, right? At the time of the writing of this article in 1946 in the U.S. Naval Proceedings, they were saying they hoped to have expanded to 59 different DIY hobbies that you could do at Alameda. The Navy encouraged active duty personnel to engage in DIY hobbyist recreation for its practical, moral, spiritual, and psychological benefits. In this 1946 Naval Proceedings, a report on Alameda noted a sailor who took advantage of the hobby shop, quote, would be a better sailor for the added skill and creativeness which he would himself develop, unquote. And Alameda was actually leading the way in what would become a well-documented post-war explosion of leisure time DIY hobbies embraced with fervor by the greatest generation throughout the 1950s. So in 1951, Palmer Paint, a package design company in the suburbs of Detroit, Michigan, debuted its first paint-by-number kit at the New York Toy Show. Max Klein, owner of the company, seems to have gotten the idea when he was approached by Picturecraft, that hobbyist toy company that I was showing you in the previous slide, they approached this package design company and said, we need a better design for shipping our kits. So Picturecraft wanted to hire Palmer Paint to improve the design of their mail-order painting kits, and in fact, Klein sensed that Picturecraft kits could have a wider appeal and a broader market than active-duty GIs. So he asked package designer Dan Robbins, pictured here, to design a prototype paint-by-number kit, which would improve on Picturecraft by providing a box with large images of the finished picture, all the brushes you would need, and stiffed-back boards on which to paint your image rather than a rolled-up canvas that you would have to stretch yourself, and bigger images so you would know what you were getting into. The military market already provided easels, brushes, and things like that. Robbins' first attempt resulted in the painting I'm showing you on the right, abstract number 1. As Robbins noted, his boss, Klein, did not care for abstract art, so Robbins created a second kit featuring images of fishermen, which became the first company-issued kit. Although they would continue to produce abstract number 1 as a kit. Before his death at age 93 in 2019, Robbins was the unofficial historian of paint by numbers. His autobiography remains an important source for the historian, and he was a consultant on the only major museum show about this history at the Smithsonian in 2001. Robbins is often considered the inventor of paint by number, a title which he embraced really enthusiastically, but of course we already know that that history already existed and those things had already been invented. For our purposes, I think I want to focus on a couple of things that happened with this phrasing of every man a Rembrandt and then the way that Dan Robbins talked about creating paint-by-number kits. Robbins consistently referenced blue-chip artists, I would call them, your Van Goghs, your Rembrandts, etc., of the past and present, and the subjects he selected for paintings and in his depictions of how various paint-by-number concepts came to be. For example, he cited the two inventors of Cubism, Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque, as direct inspirations for abstract number 1. Picasso, whose name is still pretty well recognized today, was one of the most prominent living artists of the 1950s, whose creative process, and I'm just showing you here, these are still life with chair caning, and then on the right is an example of a Braque Cubist piece from a little bit later. So you can see where there's certainly a visual correspondence and a relationship there. Although, this is my editorial comment, in the catalog that describes the abstract number 1, they say, let your imagination take flight and let the colors tell you what you see. I have a hard time not seeing a table with some fruit and a vase, so it doesn't seem particularly abstract, but, you know, whatever, we'll go with it, right? So Picasso, again, he's a blue chip artist of the 1950s. If, you know, the other guys are all dead that they're doing movies about, but Picasso was very much alive and around. And he was being celebrated. This is a 1956 film called Le Mystère Picasso that was debuted at the Cannes Film Festival and won a special prize that year, and then became kind of a standard favorite of art houses. So I want to show you a little clip of this, because I think it's interesting to think about in relation to paint by numbers. So here on the left, you can see abstract number 1. You can see the unfinished plan for abstract number 1. On the right, I'm just going to show you Picasso is drawing on the back side of a canvas that's being filmed from the other side, so you can watch his creative process happen.
Alors, qu'est-ce qu'on fait? Eh bien, on en fait un autre, non? À moins que tu sois fatigué.
Fatigué, ça me plaît. Et continuer toute la nuit, si tu veux.
By this time, there were stories about Picasso taking, if he would go out to dinner with a bunch of friends and then come for the bill, and he would be like, here, I'll sign my name on this napkin and you'll make more money from this than I could ever pay you for your meal, So, this idea that we're associating ourselves with Picasso and Braque, I'm not trying to belittle this. What I think is really interesting is we've got people are buying these kits with this kind of idea, right? But they know when you buy the kit, you don't have to face the blank canvas like Picasso does. You've got something already there for you, and then you can move your way towards Picasso. Or if, like Max Klein, the boss at Palmer Paint, you didn't really like abstract, you could buy a Fisherman kit, which weirdly, I would argue, looks very abstract. Yeah. Robbins also described in an interview how his idea for paint-by-number kits came directly from Leonardo da Vinci's practice of having assistants. He would outline the entire work that he was doing, and then assistants would paint in the different colors for different areas that weren't the super important parts like the faces. That is really true. That is how artists in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance worked. They had entire workshops. They had apprentices, so they really did have other people working on their paintings. But again, Robbins is kind of omitting the fact that other people were doing these very kind of kits, But what I think is interesting in that move is that he's really deliberately trying to say, this is like that kind of creativity, in some way. He also constantly referenced all sorts. He just completely always tied what they were doing at Craftmaster to masters of their arts. So here I'm showing you the catalog for the 1952 catalog, including the page where you can see the kits that were offered in abstract with abstract number 1, so a couple more abstracts. On that same page is a kit of Matador pictures. And so Robbins for this invokes this kinship with Ernest Hemingway, right? He said, in fact, I wanted to be Ernest Hemingway with a brush. So you're getting these associations with the fine arts, whether it's visual art or whether it's literature. To further muddy this kind of distinction between hobbyist and artist, paint-by-number kit and craft and whatnot, Robbins often repeated a story about how abstract number 1 was put into a county art fair and won first place as an original work of art, even though it was a hobby kit. And he told that story often because I think he liked the idea that, this is really, nobody can tell, people can't tell, you can fool the experts. I've never been able to corroborate that story, so I'm wondering if it's just one that he told, So regardless of how a customer felt about abstraction, a brief glance at an early catalog for the company reveals Craftmaster designs ranged through a wide spectrum of subjects and styles, varying levels of complexity, providing something for nearly everyone. You could have, and you can see, there's everything from, there's the bull picture, right? Somewhere down here, there's a sad clown. Right? So really everything, something for everyone. You could, for example, have space-age modernity. You could have a faux impressionist painting of the Parisian suburbs. You could have a kind of Degas-style ballet dancer. 2 horse pictures and cat pictures and sad clowns. Every person could strive to be a kind of Rembrandt. And the whole family could get involved at various levels of complexity for different motivations. You could get, as Junior here does, a kit called the 1-2-3 kit that only has 12 colors, or you could go all out like Dad, who buys a mural-sized painting with 90 colors. So it was something for everyone, and you could enjoy, everything from, I thought I had this quote in here, but the mom says, I painted pictures so I could decorate my house. The man says, I like a challenge. I'm going to tackle this mural painting. Sister says she has a 50 color kit, and she's doing it because it's the happiest time she's ever had, right? So there are all these different reasons why you might do a picture. I'm not convinced it's easy to complete a kit that has 90 different colors in it, by the way, but this is what they're saying. Remember, these kits exploded onto the scene in the early 50s in a new post-war consumer economy. Americans were experiencing unprecedented levels of middle-class wealth and leisure time, thanks in part to the boom economy created by World War II manufacturing, and then new economic opportunities offered by the GI Bill. And that's where the key to unlocking the popularity of paint by number and the appeal of the phrase, "every man a Rembrandt" lies. GIs, remember, had also returned home from a really destroyed world to a nation where society had really been upended. Gender roles were really upended during the war. And we don't think about this often enough. I feel like, especially in America, we don't think about it. We talk about the greatest generation, but that was a generation that carried a lot of trauma that they weren't allowed to really talk about. And across the globe, the trauma of World War II was being felt and expressed through art and literature, although, again, American veterans were not encouraged to discuss it. That anxiety was manifest in the emerging political age of anxiety, as it was called in the United States, and manifested in the explosions of things like prescriptions for Miltown, which was an early tranquilizer popular from the 50s through the 70s when doctors started to realize it had some really adverse effects. In fact, in the 1950s, it was said 1 in 20 people had been prescribed Miltown for anxiety. Whether you were a man having stomach troubles or a woman who was nervous about pregnancy, these are ads for how people were being medicated. And then the other thing I have here is a Leonard Bernstein composition based on an Auden poem. Auden was a British poet. 1947, he writes The Age of Anxiety, reflecting on World War II, and then Leonard Bernstein turned it into, a composition, musical composition. But it's everywhere. It's not just these. These are just a couple of simple examples of the way that anxiety pervaded the post-war period, even though we weren't allowed to talk about it back in the time. It is no wonder that DIY hobbies also exploded in the 1950s. As the Navy Proceedings had observed in 1946 on its report on Alameda's new hobby shop, hobbies like paint by numbers provided, quote, welcome diversion of interests from shoreside beer halls, shady dance joints, and dock hangouts into pursuits which would often actually increase the skills of men in their regular jobs. One of the concerns repeated in that Navy report was, if these guys sit around too much, they're going to be antsy, they're going to get into, it's actually, the title of the article is Idle Hands, so it's a lot of concern about what these guys are going to do if you don't keep them busy. So art, I think, was not only considered therapeutic to the individual at this point in time, but to entire nations and civilization as a whole. During World War II, the U.S. Army created the first ever military operation, the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives Program, MFAA, aka the Monuments Men. There's a movie about them from George Clooney about 10 years ago. The MFAA was dedicated solely to preserving the art treasures of Europe. This group was in charge of documenting art that should be protected from bombing during the war. After the war, the MFAA was responsible for recovering and returning millions of objects that the Nazis had stolen for Hitler's planned mega museum. By the end of the war, the idea that art in general was a precious human heritage that must be protected and indeed was part of a healthy democracy was becoming really ingrained in the mind of the American public. As reports on the varied, devastating activities of the Nazis emerged, photos like this one of Eisenhower overseeing the retrieval and return of cultural heritage were widely published. It's not just that hobbies could make every man a Rembrandt, it was that art was itself a fundamental value of a free and open society. So what I'm showing you there on the left is just the Last Supper being protected by sandbags in 1943 because Milan was about to be bombed. And then on the right, that really is Eisenhower and Omar Bradley and somebody else looking at all the Nazi art stolen during the war. General Eisenhower became president in 1953 and served 2 terms. During World War II, Eisenhower had found himself in the unenviable position of being privy to a lot of top secret information, but not high enough ranking to have any say in decision-making, which contributed to him becoming, as he described in a letter, concerned about my mental health and ready to blow a fuse. This is when he says he turned to what he called the muse of painting to soothe his anxiety. While Ike was in office, his personal secretary, Theodore Stevens, actually handed out paint-by-number kits to visiting celebrities and dignitaries with the idea that they would benefit as well. And here you can see J. Edgar Hoover's contribution to this. So the idea was these folks would complete these kits and then return them to the White House, and then Stevens held an exhibition in the White House during Ike's time in office. Ethel Merman, John Foster Dulles, like a lot of people completed these kits for the White House collection, which is now the Dwight D. Eisenhower Memorial Library. Eisenhower's wartime colleague, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, also became a passionate advocate of cultivating painting as a habit for a healthy mind, and even as a necessity for men with great public responsibilities because it was so effective at easing stress. Famously became a Sunday painter, published a whole book about it. On top of alleviating stress, both Eisenhower and Churchill discussed privately and publicly that art, following the philosopher George Santayana's arguments, was the hallmark of a free civilization. And incidentally, this idea that art was essential to freedom and democracy was also being pursued by the CIA, who worked with MoMA to send shows of American art abroad as a kind of psyops. And AMGAS, the occupying military government of the United States in Berlin and in Germany, where they were organizing, the military was organizing shows of art to rehabilitate the German public who had spent 12 years being told by the Nazis that modern art was degenerate and there were only certain kinds of art they could like. So the military was literally putting together art shows to therapize the public. These are, of course, things I'm working on, but they're outside the scope for today, but I just wanted to mention that. And here at the Presidential Library, you can see too, this is one of the docents there contributing, or her painting of Ike, paint-by-number kit painting that she created during Eisenhower's administration, which is now in their collection. I mentioned that Dan Robbins invoked the name of Leonardo da Vinci in his inspiration for creating paint-by-numbers. Palmer Paint created at least 3 versions of a Last Supper kit, all created by the same artist, Adam Grant, who we've seen before. These kits increased in complexity from about 30 colors to 50 colors to the last one being a 90-color kit, because he kept wanting to improve on the product. In addition to Palmer, at least 2 other companies, Picturecraft, who I mentioned earlier, and Art Award, issued kits for DIY Leonardo paintings, The Last Supper, and the Mona Lisa. Anecdotally, several sources report that The Last Supper is the most popular paint-by-number kit of all time. I've not been able to confirm that, but I think it's important to note that The Last Supper was in the public mind in the 1950s. All those images of it being preserved during the war, for example. It was a great masterpiece that was in danger of disappearing. Even though it had been saved from destruction by Nazi bombs, it was well known that this painting was an experimental technique used by Leonardo, combining 2 different media of painting, one based in water, one based in oil. And as you know, water and oil don't always mix well. So the painting has been, for many years, I mean, really since the time it was finished, kind of deteriorating. So in the 50s, there were a number of discussions about and then efforts at restoration. So this Last Supper needed to be preserved. And I think at that time, it had the feeling that it wasn't just a painting. You know, it was the kind of thing that Hitler had tried to collect and destroy, right? And so I think it's interesting to see The Last Supper as a painting kit. Now, there's certainly also personal piety reasons why people like this kit. And again, in my larger project, I'm talking about that, but I just wanted to point out that I think this is really tied into this idea of we're saving something important about society. It's just a reminder of that. Yeah, multiple 1950 sources expressed a sense of urgency that The Last Supper needed to be preserved in copies in various media because the original was doomed. And there's a stained glass one at Forest Lawn Cemetery out in LA. There's a mosaic one in Florida at this point in time, media that would be more durable than paint. This was another way a consumer of paint-by-numbers could not only enjoy leisure and de-stress, but also participate in saving civilization itself. I want to note here that the Palmer paint artist who created these Last Supper kits was Adam Grant, a Polish Jew who had survived Auschwitz and emigrated to Toledo after the war, which is where he started working for Palmer Paint. And in fact, Grant's story is that the reason that he was able to survive in Auschwitz was because the Nazis liked his paintings, and so he painted for them, which I think is a nice kind of footnote to the idea of, like, this is a time when we're trying to preserve everything. So when people talk about the history of paint by numbers, they often want to talk about the kitschy nature of the finished paintings, conformity in 1950s culture. Others look back with nostalgia at this brief craze or raise questions about originality, creativity, even the 1950s era debates about whether abstraction and modernity were better or whether traditional painting was better. What I hope to have demonstrated tonight is that there are some other important considerations about why we should take this seemingly incongruous slogan, "Every man a Rembrandt," seriously for what it tells us about America in the 1950s. And I want to thank you for your attention. That is where I'm stopping. And I'd love to talk about any questions or observations or disagreements. Who were these kits marketed to? Yeah, these kits were marketed not just to children, but to the entire family. Yeah, and I mean, the kits were ranging in complexity from very simple ones, you know, that might represent Mickey Mouse or Tom Mix, or, I mean, there's a lot of pop culture TV stars that you could get little kits, very simple colors. But then there were the 90 color Last Supper kit was definitely for adults, you know? So yeah, they really, it's a wild assortment. And I think it really was, like, before the war, I had said, right, there are these like little artist kits, and they're really for kids. But the paint by numbers was really for a lot for adults. Yeah. Such a good question. So the question is about, Damien has, in the family, there's a paint by number kit, Portrait of Jesus, that has been the subject of some debate about whether it was original-ish or not. And that's that tension and unease about the idea of whether or not these things that are mass reproduced, and then you follow the rules, like, can that mean anything? Or are you just, to quote that guy from 1950 in American art, are you just a moron, you know? And interestingly, there's been one study done interviewing people who did Last Supper kits, so that same kind of religious genre, and a lot of people did not see it as even making art. They really saw it as praying and personal piety and meditation. So I think we can't discount a lot of different motives for doing paint by numbers that don't have anything to do with whether I'm going to be Rembrandt. And yes, people did modify them. Yeah, I mean, you can find all different skill levels. Some people blended their colors a lot more. But I would say even if he did just follow the numbers, there's a lot of things that could be going on with making a painting like that. Yeah. Yes, yeah. Oh, are there any companies still making paint by numbers kits? Yes, like Dimension Craft does some, and I don't think Craftmaster doesn't exist anymore, but that name brand might still be out there. But yeah, you can go to most of the local hobby shops and buy paint by numbers kits. And then there's a whole, and actually these existed in the 50s too, a whole different, like, mosaic by numbers, tile by numbers. There's a recent version of this where you place little diamond, not real diamonds, but like little sparkly things into a canvas, and you make a picture that way. So there's a lot out there since just the paint by numbers. Yeah. Yeah, and actually it's interesting because at the time of the 1950s and 60s, you do have these paint by number kits. You have I've been able to find one adult coloring book, and it was a satirical one, like a political satirical one, right? So it's interesting to see now this kind of wave of They're all only in really one kind of style, though, which I think is interesting because paint by numbers was it was a huge variety of things you could do. So, but I think it's much in the same vein. We do have that urge to create, and a lot of us are not Picasso and cannot look at the blank canvas without fear, When I was in graduate school, the Smithsonian held that exhibition of the paint by numbers paintings at the National Museum of American History, and it's a nice show. They solicited paint by numbers paintings from people all over the country, and then there's a lot of oral history about why people did the paintings and things like that. And I thought it was fantastic. And then the more I looked at it, the more I thought, I think I'm a contrarian by nature, and so all my grad school friends were like, "Oh, this is so kitschy," and I was like, it was so widespread. It has to have some historical importance that we're not looking at if we're just dismissing it as something kitschy or, that like mindless conformists do or something like that. So that's where it started. And I always, like as a kid, I loved watching Bob Ross on TV, and I kind of felt like I am now. Bob Ross is extremely popular, but when I was in grad school, it was very much like, oh my God, Bob Ross, and I was like, but I love that, so yeah, there's so many interesting reasons why people do stuff like this, and it reflects a lot about what's going on in a culture, the way that high art does, and I also work on Thomas Kinkade, because I think I just have a contrary nature, and I want to prove to people that these are historically important, even if you don't think they're pretty, So, yeah. The comment was about how in the tradition of Russian icons, you are expected to make exact copies, going back to the original sacred St. Luke version, and that's a good thing and that's a value. And it does highlight something that is very particular to 20th century understandings of what's important about art. And it's very specific to American culture being extremely individualistic and the Enlightenment idea of the great man. There's a lot going on there. In China, making copies of paintings is also considered an homage and something that every really good artist makes copies of classic art. Not even as a learning experience where, in artistic training in the West, you might go into the Louvre and be expected to draw copies of things to learn. But the idea in China was always the copy is an homage to the original, right? And it's a good thing, right? So yeah, the kind of skittishness that Western culture developed around the idea of copying and originality is tied up with this as well, especially the way that people have not wanted to talk about it in a serious way. Yeah. And I was just looking at, because I'm thinking about Thomas Kinkade too, and he's a religious painter, and Leonardo was a religious painter, but people aren't scared of talking about him, but they're scared of talking about Thomas Kinkade. And one of the biggest art critics and writers today in my field is a guy named James Elkins, and I was just reading a piece he wrote, and he was like, I can't even talk about this. It was a Christian painting of, it was a contemporary artist Christian painting. He's like, I can't even talk about this because it's not good. And I thought to myself, and he also was like, and it's not good because it contains religious sentiment. And I thought, I feel like maybe he's scared of it, because he wants to make sure everybody knows he has really good taste. I really do. I really feel like that's a thing that's underlying a lot of this as well. So, I don't know. I might be getting far afield from just the history of paint by numbers, but that stuff is fascinating to me. And, this, yeah. What good historian is afraid of material? It's so strange, But he's not a historian. He's a critic, which, whatever. My dream is that one year at College Art Association, he'll be in the audience when I present some of this. And I can say, you're scared of religion, James. It's my dream. So, thank you very much for your attention. I really appreciate it. Thanks for coming out tonight. So.
Production facilities provided by Access Fort Wayne. Learn more under the Explore tab at acpl.info.